And now this program has also been in the works for almost a year. Frank Stasio called me and said, we did this great program at Duke, and I'd love to do it again in the public library. And I said, great. So here we are. So sometimes it takes a long time, but I'm sure it'll be really worth it. Frank Stasio is the host of The State of Things on North Carolina Public Radio. Previously, he was a host and anchor in NPR in Washington. He's been involved in radio since he was 19. He's also involved in many important organizations in Durham, including the Religious Coalition for Nonviolence, the Durham Friends Prison Reentry, and he's on the board of the Durham Co-op Market. You often meet him at the Durham Farmers Market, and I consider him one of Durham's treasures. So welcome with me, Frank Stasio.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Joanne. It's terrific to see you. Joanne is right. This program has been in the making for a while. If you are familiar with the show, The State of Things, you know the kind of people that we talk to and the breadth of ideas that get expressed there. And one of the themes for me that comes up over and over again is the theme of resilience. People who one way or another have endured some form of catastrophe, many forms of catastrophe, and come back stronger and in many ways transformed spiritually and emotionally, and sometimes even physically. And this idea is, I sort of perseverate over it. I can't quite drop the idea about the power of resilience. And in 1 week, I had the pleasure of talking to the Reverend Dr. Luke Powery and Rabbi Raachel Jurovics. And in two conversations separated by less than a day, the word catastrophe came up with regard to their people. The catastrophes of the Jewish people in 64 AD, losing the temple, and then, of course, the Shoah, the Holocaust. And then the middle passage for African Americans coming to this country enslaved. But it was not about the catastrophe. It was about the resilience. It was about a response to what otherwise would have been a kind of inhumanity that is unimaginable and really unspeakable. And yet it was imagined by some, spoken by others, and somehow there was a resilience by those people to endure. So it spoke to me of the essential human capacity of resilience that all of us have somehow. And then what does that mean culturally if a group of people who identify as one group or another with a set of cultural norms come through it as a group? And how does that, and particularly when religion plays such an important part in this case, in these kind of cultural identities. So from top to bottom, from the sort of the highest level of social architecture, culture, to the most essential human characteristics that seem to be hardwired within us, it struck me as the most profound subject. And these two individuals who I've had on the show more than once also struck me as uniquely qualified to talk about this. And so that's how the program is born. And so I won't talk any more about it. We'll actually get down to it. And I want to introduce to you Rabbi Raachel Jurovics, who is the spiritual leader of a group called Yavneh, a Jewish Renewal Community. It is an ecumenical group that, among other things, encourages Jews and Christians to study together and to study each other's faiths in order to understand and practice their own traditions better. Rabbi Jurovics, welcome.
Thank you.
Good to have you here.
Thank you.
And the Reverend Dr. Luke Powery is Dean of Duke Chapel. He is the author of many books, one of them, Dem Dry Bones, Preaching, Death, and Hope. Reverend Dr. Powery.
Good to be here.
Let me start with you, Reverend Dr. Powery, about your book. You've written a number of books on the spiritual as an art form and also as a cultural artifact. Talk about the importance of the spiritual and sort of how it fits into this conversation.
Sure. How much time do you have, Frank? I think the first thing that I think is important to say about the spirituals is when we think about their role and meaning in the life of a people, is that it's one way to interrogate that meaning is to interrogate the soundscape. that it's hard for me to just talk about the spirituals, because I view the spirituals as musical memorabilia created on the anvil of misery, that misery being the cruciform of slavery. And so for me, it is an art form. African Americans, the enslaved through various stories and cultural myths, such as High John the Conqueror, would see the spirituals, even the nomenclature, the name, to say spirituals. There was a deep belief that these songs were from the divine, from God. An ex-slave was interviewed, and he said that's where we got the name spirituals from, because the Holy Spirit done revealed them to us. And so for me, I think it's a critical insight to see these songs as, in many ways, divine intervention in the midst of suffering. And we come to learn even what Zora Neale Hurston would call the mood of the spirituals by hearing them. So I've had a long day, and I think I'm going to offer a spiritual. Soon will be done with the troubles of the world, the troubles of the world, the troubles of the world. Soon will be done with the troubles of the world, going home to live with God. No more weeping and wailing. No more, oh, no more weeping and wailing. No more, oh, no more weeping and wailing, going home to live with God. So these spirituals, these songs of the Spirit are songs of suffering, but yet they're also songs of community, and they're songs of hope. And as Pauli Murray from Durham has said, hope is a song in a weary throat. And so for me, they are a sign of hope in the midst of death.
You have talked about the moans and the wails in those songs. There's a song that talks about the aspiration to leave all that behind, but I've heard you say that much of the music and the way it's sung, and you talked about a kind of cultural memorabilia, are actually the moans from the bellies of those ships carried forward.
Yeah, exactly. The moans and the groans and the shrieks and the sighs that might have been heard in the belly of slave ships are the precursor to the spirituals. And you can just continue the lineage from the spirituals to the blues, through jazz, through gospel. But the root of this expression of hope is really can be found in the moan or the groan.
How does it work to bring forward the pain, the thing you want to leave behind, the thing you aspire to leave forever, to bring that forward and reproduce it over and over again? And in that, we find transcendence. How does that work?
I think if one wants to be truthful and honest, that the pain of the past may not be the exact pain of the present, but there is still the existential reality of humanity is still very much the reality of pain and sorrow and suffering. It is the human experience in many ways, not the totality. And so in many ways, that's the miracle that James Weldon Johnson called these songs a miracle that they were even created. The miracle is that these songs are still so relevant, created by the enslaved, the outcast, those on the marginalized, on the margins of society, on the borderlands of human existence. These enslaved or even the unknown black bards are our teachers today, are our healers today. As we sing these songs or read these songs, and they still are so relevant to the human experience today. They cross culture, they cross time, and that's nothing but a miracle of God in my mind.
Even when we don't have a genetic or genealogical link to the particular experience, there is something that transcends and is essential in that song that speaks to all of our human experience.
Exactly.
Powerful stuff. Mm-hmm. Rabbi Jurovics, you had a remarkable experience, it seems to me, in your exploration of spirituality, the power of Jewish spirituality and Judaism as a religion. And I know you're always very curious about the expansiveness of this, how it relates to Jews in particular and the world at large. This is a great this is your project. And I'm excited that you spend time talking with me about it, because it's always edifying. Talk about going to the Czech Republic and the Torah scroll. It's a remarkable story.
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation again. We should start meeting regularly. 3 people walk into a bar, and something transpires, and it always does. It is. It's so evocative of a kind of spiritual universality that whenever we are in the presence of an authentic expression of a spiritual truth, as we were just privileged to hear, it goes right through all of us and kind of not only touches our hearts, but kind of moves things around a little bit and requires us to rethink. You said you'd had a long day, and then you broke into that song, and you might have had a hard day, but you solved some existential problems while getting rid of your fatigue. So it's fabulous. I love it. I discovered, by, again, one of those small miracles, that a Torah scroll that was in the ark of a congregation where I formerly served as rabbi, which I knew had come from a town called Hershmanov Miestec in the Czech Republic. I had looked up the history of the town and read about it and put the information in a folder and promptly forgotten a salient point. What I remembered was that the town was destroyed by the Nazis during the Second World War. And so that's what I would tell people when showing the scroll during the many opportunities to discuss basic Judaism in 45 minutes with a group of students, and in this instance with students from Southeastern Baptist Seminary. And when I got to that sentence about this beautiful scroll, which is quite large and has a unique Czech calligraphy in it, and said that the town, which I mispronounced terribly at that time, had been destroyed, a voice from the back of the room said, no, I'm from there. Yeah, oof. So we spoke about that afterwards, and it turns out that she had grown up in the next larger town over a little bit, and the synagogue in Hershmanov Miestec had recently been completely renovated. That during the war it had sat empty, and it had been used alternatively as storage, as a movie theater, temporarily as a school, but it wasn't used as a synagogue from about 1940, 42, something like that. And I was just taken aback because I had no idea that anyone was paying any attention to all of these empty synagogues in the Czech Republic, and thought it was so phenomenal that I organized a trip to go back and take the scroll. If you want to know how a really large Torah scroll travels, it's in a golf bag. A hard-sided golf bag. We have never, ever been asked any questions by security. I don't know how that makes you feel, because in an X-ray machine, this does not look like golf clubs. So we organized a group. We went back, took the scroll, had what may have been the first service with Torah reading in that synagogue, since it had been closed almost 70 years before. And the power of walking into that space and what it felt like to lift that scroll into the ark from which it had been taken. And as I do think that there is life in everything, as it had been taken in every expectation of destruction, that there was something that happened in that space. The energetic change in that space was palpable. So we learned a number of things while we were there. And one of the most important was something that Margaret Atwood wrote about in her recent Mad Adam trilogy. I don't know if any of you have read that. But she observed how it only takes one generation for something to be cut off completely. Could be a language, could be a religious practice, could be a transmission of a musical tradition. And growing up in a liberal democratic family in Southern California in the 50s, when I heard the phrase godless communism, what I heard was, oh, that's a right-wing canard about something that's just, it can't be that bad. They're just saying that because they want us to be upset. No, when you stand in a place where faith has been suppressed for 7 decades, first by the Nazis and then by the communists, then in the 28 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall, the struggle to find one's connection, one's spiritual center for Jews and Christians in the Czech lands and everywhere where there was communist suppression is a heroic act. It's very difficult because so much of the transmission was impeded. So few people had any memory even of grandparents who had any sort of spiritual life. Nobody passed on to them. What does it mean if you're a Christian? How is a service conducted? What's the meaning of church time? What do I do between one Sunday and the next to live a Christian life? What does community mean? And similarly for the Jews, only barely 10% of the Jews from the Czech Republic survived. So that connection led to 3 additional trips, many more opportunities to visit places with very rich spiritual resonance, the opportunity to learn with primarily Christian colleagues and some Jewish colleagues there to figure out what are the next steps. How do you nurture? I understand that the museum has a seed program. How do you nurture those seeds that might have been left out to get a little bit too dry? What do you do when you've faced that kind of a discrepancy? What do you do when you're thrown into the hold of a ship and completely deracinated from your home and your people and your traditions, your tribe, and you're sent someplace where nobody even thinks of you as a person and has no respect for what you have to teach? and the experience of those who were persecuted and murdered in Europe because they were the other, whether it was the Jews or the Seventh-day Adventists or gays and lesbians or disabled people or old people who couldn't move fast enough in the line. What do you do when who you are is denied so profoundly, and then a generation and a half, 2 generations later, try to reformulate a life of the Spirit? So in my life, that particular Torah scroll and then a subsequent scroll, which my current community is honored to provide a home for, are a touchstone for me in how to think about the power of faith and of a tradition that reflects a kind of human artistry of yearning to pull forward from a damaged past something that we can live with now.
What's remarkable about the story, you said there's only about 10% of the population there is now Jewish, and yet it does seem that the entire community has embraced this as a way of restoring a kind of spiritual identity, even though they don't identify in particular with Judaism. And yet this symbol is so powerful, and the need for this seems so important that everyone seems to have rallied around it.
Yeah, thank you for remembering that detail. The town of Yavneh has about 5,000 residents, none of whom are Jewish. Maybe the total Jewish population of the Czech Republic is about that of the Triangle, maybe 6,000 Jews, or maybe that's Wake County, something in that neighborhood. It's not a lot, and in this town, what they do have are people who remember what happened when their friends were taken away, people who are now in their late 70s, early 80s, and people whose parents were in the resistance, and people who are trying to rebuild their own Christian faith. There's an extraordinary level of cooperation between the Hussite Church, which is a Reformed Catholic tradition. About 60% of their priests are women. That's the Reformed part, I think. I may get messages about that. From my
inbox is filling up now.
Oh yeah, well that's okay. It's just my radical nun friends who are writing to me, and the Lutheran Church and the Catholic Church on the square, and it's very unusual for Christian community to do well in the Czech Republic. It's very difficult to rebuild that sense of what does it mean to live a fully formed Christian life. And in this town, those 3 pastors from previously competing traditions work very hard together to nurture that, and they care very much that the town has a Jewish history. And so the town and some of its leadership raised money, some of it with the help of the European Union, to restore the synagogue. The adjacent building became the housing for a beautiful museum of Bohemian art, and many of the artists in the museum are Jewish artists from that area. And they've renovated what they call the Rabbi's house to the left of the synagogue for public programming and for educational programming, multi-faith programming, and so on. But there is something about the space itself. It's a beautiful, beautiful little synagogue. And the vice mayor of the town, who does most of the civil weddings, they're always in the synagogue. People want to be in there. The space is just gorgeous. So we had an opportunity on one visit to watch a wedding from up in what used to be the women's balcony. And it was just great. I mean, this was like in the middle of the week, and maybe like Tuesday afternoon, and the bride had this fabulous dress, and the groom was in very formal clothes, and everybody was sort of trailing bright colors and wonderful excitement, and of course the baby, because that's how we do things now, right? And the baby, the ring was in there somewhere with the baby. It was great. And somebody from the town played the piano, and the vice mayor just pulled herself up to her probably about 6 feet tall. She's wonderful. And this beautiful ceremony, and the space just resonated with joy and spirit and a great deal of love. So it makes me feel good to know that this space is used for prayer, and when you walk into it, even though there's just no regular Jewish worship that happens there, you know you're setting foot on sacred ground. You just know it.
I want to pursue this business of the religious connection, though, a little more deeply, because I find it curious in some ways. I mean, we have to accept that if this is an essential human quality, this resilience, then atheists and people not of non-faith traditions or not of faith traditions should be able to access it. It is found in these faith traditions in unique ways. All the more so if you think about the spiritual being rooted in the Christian tradition, which one can easily point to as the cause of the Middle Passage. Christianity had much to do with promoting and supporting the colonialism that was dependent on slavery and a post-colonial economy that still depends on abused labor. So why pick that tradition to make your songs? What is it about that tradition?
Yeah. You know, there's various perspectives on what makes a spiritual. I mean, because you're drawing on, and there's, in the scholarship, the early 20th century, there are debates about how much of this is from Christianity, what is from Africa, what is from America, what are from the Methodists, the Presbyterians, how much of this is sort of authentic too. And so those debates are out there. And many of this, I mean, the spirituals also, I would say, I think it's important, or the religious folk songs, as some would say, are not all Christianized in some, right? They're not all about Jesus per se. There's a sort of a general notion of God and faith, or perhaps no mention at all. And so there is this great variety. I think that's important. But I think what's so interesting about what you raise is, I don't know why, but there is a sense, you know, the story of High John the Conqueror that Zora Neale Hurston, in her book, The Sanctified Church, tells this story about High John was first a whisper, and then that whisper took on flesh. And he took on flesh when he saw the great suffering of the enslaved. And High John then came and visited the people. And he says, for this kind of suffering, I'm paraphrasing, we need some kind of song. And so, under the watch of the old Massa, they travel to hell, then they don't find the song. They travel to heaven, and there is the old maker, God. And God gives them this tune that they can shape and bend. And then they return back to their work on the plantation. And under the eyes of old Massa, you have this great sense of song and laughter as a form of resistance to the oppression. And I think what the spirituals represent in many ways is, even in that story, to hit a straight lick with a crooked stick. This idea that you are using what, you know, people may sing, steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. And some on the outside may think, well, you know, they just want to go to heaven. No, but many of the interpreters, even Frederick Douglass, who was an ex-slave, in his autobiography speaks of how songs such as these really were code songs or a mask for talking about going to freedom, talking about stealing away privately or to head up north. And so for me, these songs are used in a very there's a sense of creativity, a creative form of resistance, to take the tools in some way of the of the oppressor, and then to use it against the oppressor. And so there's this wonderful sense of humor, even the laughter. You heard in the news recently, some African-American women were pulled off a train of some kind in California for laughing.
For laughing while black.
That's right. And so laughter and song, and what you find, not just in that contemporary existence, but historically, they would not allow, those in power would not allow the enslaved to gather even for prayer, because there were fear of rebellions. Once Nat Turner rebellions, there were a fear of revolutions being formed around prayer, around singing, around these various forms of practices. And so they began to be viewed as a sign of danger. And so therefore that continues in many ways as we see this latest example.
Well, I think you put your finger on it, too, that essential to resilience is ingenuity, right? Yeah. Having to figure out a way around whatever it is that is the oppressive force. Mm-hmm. And because you rarely have many tools, they figured out how to keep those from you. You either repurpose the tools of the master or the oppressor, or you make your own, and then turn them into what you need. And so the singers of the songs, the people, the cognoscenti, right? Those of us who are in the know about what these songs mean, it's an entirely different experience for us. But it's precisely the ingenuity, human ingenuity and creativity that will not be oppressed and finds its way out, finds its expression.
That's right. And it's that particular art form of a song. It's not. A spiritual is not, even though now in our day the choral arrangements of spirituals are so nice and sweet and beautiful, and a long tradition in the concert, halls. But a song, particularly singing of the spiritual in that context, was really a matter of life and death. A song was a nonviolent weapon against oppression. A song can be dangerous. It's not just always about the sweet melody, but there is also this undercurrent at times. Yeah, there are songs of redemption, one might say, but there are also songs of resistance. And that is many times the subtext of the text that is, I think, important to recognize, that even the sound, how something sounds, is deep with meaning and may say something against the suffering that one is going through without explicitly saying anything about it.
You remember when Dancing in the Streets in the 1960s was considered subversive, and there were radio stations, particularly in the South, that wouldn't play it because they thought it was a call to arms. It was a soul song, it was a Motown song. Well, the cantors of the Jewish faith, of course, are wonderful, but you are the people of the book. When we talk about ingenuity, I think we should start in the Czech Republic, but then move back in time. There's a wonderful story about how the Torah scroll was saved, and I think that points to some of the ingenuity that we're talking about here.
Yeah, if with your permission, if I talk a little bit about that, and then see about linking what Luke has brought to the conversation to the way I understand the millennia-long process of subversive use of the word that is accounts for a good deal of Jewish resilience. The Torah scroll. Well, there were 13 scrolls in the Ark in Hershon of Miestets at the time that they were taken to Prague, and I think that there were that many because so many smaller towns had already been. The Jewish communities had already been rounded up, and that synagogues were sending their scrolls to a more central place, and this town happened to be the largest town with a Jewish population in its area. The Nazis collected a great deal of ritual objects, Torah scrolls, prayer books, and works of fabric, like the curtains that would close in front of an ark, for example, or the paraments that would go over a reading table. And they storehoused them in Prague, and some very courageous scholars and curators suggested to the Nazi commandant that maybe they'd like to think about preserving these things, because then they could have a museum of the destroyed culture, the culture that did not merit continuity, this dangerous and sort of diseased form of humanity that they were doing such a good job of wiping out. And apparently that sounded like not such a bad idea, so a substantial proportion of the scrolls were simply warehoused in synagogues in Prague, and along with these other objects. And the curators tried very hard to determine the provenance of each scroll and everything that came in, and to tag it and to watch over these things during the war years. And they hoped that the war would end quickly and that everything could be returned to its former owners. And by the time the war ended, 90% of the Czech Jews were dead. And there were very few functioning communities. And even now there's Prague and maybe, I hesitate to say maybe Bratislava, but elsewhere not so much. You have synagogues that are museums that have wonderful programming, but they don't have congregations anymore. So there was this hiding away of all of the liturgical art forms of the Jews in Bohemia and Moravia, and particularly the placing of scrolls and books which carried a millennia's-long tradition of using the word to respond to historical change. So what the Israelites learned during the Babylonian exile was that if you expanded your understanding of God's sovereignty in the world to be all inclusive, then you didn't have to stop being an Israelite because you were no longer in Israel. And by the time they came back after 50 years, even though they rebuilt the temple and they reinstituted biblical Jewish practices, there had been a transformation of understanding about the nature of divinity, about what it means to engage with the text, to interpret the text, to figure out how do you find mechanisms of day-to-day Jewish living. How do you create liturgy? How do you create religious community that is not based on a central shrine? And even when you come back and you rebuild that central shrine, you've still got all that new stuff there. And that new stuff continued to evolve so that with the loss of the Second Temple, there was a pre-existing mechanism for using the power of the word to reformulate its own meaning, to make it possible for an entirely new expression of the Israelite faith to come into being, what we now know as Rabbinic Judaism. This was the Judaism that Jesus knew, that in Jesus' lifetime was at what was happening parallel to whatever was going on with the temple services and the hierarchical structure of the biblical form of having a priestly caste that was a kind of, if not an intermediary, was facilitating contact with divinity. And with the loss of the temple, the choice was, you can say, I've been torn from my home and I have nothing and I'll wait to see what circumstance makes of me, or you can say, I no longer have what informed my life completely before, and I have the resource of the word, of the song, of the already created liturgical responses that had been evolving since the previous exile. I can make something new out of this. I don't have to give up what existed before. I can transform it. I can make the table in my home an altar, I can make a blessing before I eat, and that means what I'm eating is as if it were an offering in the temple. I can chant a blessing in community, or a series of blessings, and that is equivalent to all the work that the priests and Levites did at this time of day, back in the day when there was a temple. I can transform everything to make it possible to not lose touch with the divinity that has informed me and my people's lives, even at that point, for more than 1,000 years.
But there again is the ingenuity and the creativity that is essential in resilience. All of these disruptions, the Babylonian captivity, the destruction of the temple, disruptions to the cultural life of a people, we're talking about an immutable force in God and our relationship to it, which is quite special. We have been chosen by an immutable force. There's not a lot, it doesn't feel like there's a lot of flexibility in there, does there? I mean, in some ways, what do you do when God doesn't change, is eternal, and is all-knowing and all present? And the idea that we can change form and still...
I'm sorry, I don't recognize that definition.
That's not your God?
That's not my God.
How many believe in that? No, I'm not going to do that here. But if there is a God in those times, was that not a God who might have been recognizable? And again, if we're talking about a religion... Well, you go ahead and correct any of that first.
That was a really good question, Frank.
One of my favorite gods. We do think of religion as being bound to something that is pretty hard to change, and yet we have to change in its face.
Right.
Did I get out of that one pretty well?
Yeah. Yeah, that was good.
Not bad.
It was very good. So the whole purpose of, just as a very quick sidebar, I don't think any group of human beings is foreclosed the possibility of using their creativity in response to what they understand to have been their history, the value set that they have formulated for themselves, to do the same thing. So I don't think atheists are shut out of the game at all. This is not only a field for theists to play in, but the precise nature of rabbinic Judaism is that you honor the original text message, but you claim the authority to have it mean what you see it mean in this moment. So you can accept that the relationship with divinity, divinity isn't immutable. Divinity changes in response to a reciprocal experience lived by the people. And so part of what was understood, and it was one of the most poignant bits of text left from the post-temple period, is a description of how the divine presence withdrew from the temple as it was being overrun by the Romans, and the description of the destruction in the city itself, and the rivers of blood, and the horrific violence. I like to say this as often as possible: if you think the Romans are ever the good guys, you're wrong. Spiffy uniforms, which they had in common with another empire that we saw in the 20th century. That's about the end of it. Vicious, an absolutely vicious attack. And so here you have the Holy Spirit withdrawing from the outer courtyard and moving into an inner sanctuary, moving behind a curtain, moving on top of the ark, moving to the roof of the Holy of Holies, moving to the inner wall, moving to the outer wall, and leaping out into the world to be with the people who are now going to be dispersed. That's a different God. It is a very different God. So God gets to change. Our reciprocal understanding of how we live into a relationship with God changes, as I suspect you found in the study of the spirituals, that there has to be a theological wrestling, and it has to have a form that can hold it. So in both instances, the word is the form, and the process moves along with the life experience of the people throughout history, which is which is why in this time of post-Shoah Jewish living, many of us feel deeply invested in figuring out what gets pulled forward, what are the words that still hold power, and where's the growing edge? What do we do? Because we can't reproduce what we lost any more than Yochanan ben Zakkai could have reproduced the temple practice for his followers.
I mean, I think with the conception of God, or I think on one level with the spirituals, what's very interesting about them is that there's many more spirituals on a suffering Jesus than the resurrection of Jesus, but it's the suffering that is so critical, because that's where the deep resonance with the human experience was, which I think this is where, yes, Christian religion historically can be equated, and perhaps so still, with colonialism and that brutal history. But there's also a way that reading Christianity flips the script in so many ways, in that we can think, well, power is found in weakness, right? And foolishness is actually wisdom. And so we find the spirituals, the enslaved, focusing on this suffering Jesus, and which in many ways is a very different sort of understanding of who God is in the midst of their own suffering. I mean, there are spirituals that, say, my God is so high, you can't get over him, so low, you can't get under him, so wide, you can't get around him. And there is this deep sense, I think, of faith that comes through, that what God did in the past, God will do today, but it's how that is done. The spirituals themselves, as a musical genre, represent this subversive spirituality, even this subversive God who flips things on its head.
It looks like a flip, although you could also call it a radical revival of the original message, right?
Right.
That what has been flipped was that form of Christianity that was used through some form of political jujitsu to somehow justify what happened in the 16th and 17th century. I know you may have questions. Joanne, we can do that, right? Do questions? So if you have questions, and were we going to use that microphone? We could bring that down to the floor. I have more questions, so you're okay. But we've got a mic there. So raise your hand, and we'll get you the mic as I ask this other question. There is while the mic is getting over there, it seems to me a more complicated project, maybe not more complicated, but a different kind of complication for the people we now call African American, who in that middle passage may not have considered themselves Africans writ large. And so then the idea of building an identity, of finding an identity in this new place and under these conditions becomes a project of its own, doesn't it?
Oh, that's a whole session in and of itself. I mean, wrapped up in that is the politics of racial naming, and who creates these categories anyway in the first place. African American, obviously before African American, it wasn't African American, it was black. Before black, there was Negro. There was, right? Who's creating these? Who has the power to name you, or do you have the power to name yourself? And in some ways, this problem, or sort of naming oneself, is an ongoing, is a legacy in some ways of this history of colonialism, because even today you have, what does it even mean to be African American? Are you talking about people that were born in Africa but somehow have become U.S. citizens and they are African American? Are you talking about people who were born in America or their ancestors? What about the Caribbean? So it's a very complex, I think, reality, but it's, a race is a social construction. I think this is, and so for what purpose, to what end? In many ways, it is to categorize people into groups so that whoever is in power can control and name their reality.
Right.
And that's a huge problem, and so which is why post-colonial thought and et cetera can be very helpful in going forward.
I would just want to follow up on that, and then I'll go right to your question. But how important is it in this sort of large picture, this question of resilience, to have an identity? The problem for Jews in the post-temple era was, who are we? What does it mean to be Jewish now, right? So that meant it was an important question to somehow remain or maintain some kind of Jewish identity. Is that important, and is it important in all cases for people, cultural groups, to maintain? Is resilience somehow contingent on an identity?
That's a great Rabbi. Do you want to take that one?
You can think about that, and then we'll take this question because he's dying to ask one. And then if you have an answer, we can do it. That'd be great. Go right ahead. Did you have an answer? Please.
We'll come back to the answer. That's fine. Let's do other things.
Okay. Well, I'm so pleased with...
Please hold this mic.
Yeah, thank you.
Right up
I'm so pleased with the richness and breadth of this discussion. And likewise, it'll take me 2 or 3 minutes to set this up. But I wanted to say, I recently found a commentary by Frank Hyman, who is a gardening person here in Durham. It was titled, The Confederacy was a con job on whites and still is. There's a brilliant thesis. And so here we are in the town where C.P. Ellis and Ann Atwater broke out of this game of getting pitted against each other and different faiths being used. As I listened to discussions of, I'm going to try this, Hirschman and Yevstitz, and all the destruction of so many villages, it took me back to my traveling to Guatemala with Witness for Peace, where a similar number of villages of the Mayan people were destroyed in a genocide. Now, that genocide was not just spontaneous, it was carried out with ample help from Washington and from Israel of all countries and of all people, so soon after the events of World War II. And so we end up having people push colonialism, and that's still going on, and misuse of our faiths to draw us away from the struggles that we really need to be engaged with right now. And so we become the Romans who would destroy the city of Fallujah in Iraq. So what I'm getting to is, Rabbi, as you mentioned, what is the growing edge? What is the growing edge of our faith that's going to help break us out of this indifference and distraction that keeps us from engaging the oppression that still persists pretty much in Guatemala, but also, as so many people now aware in the Black Lives Matter movement, are making the connection from Ferguson to Palestine. How do we break out of simple tribalism and move on to the kind of informed awareness and action that we would have hoped that the Germans had, that we would have hoped that the Romans had, we would have hoped that all these predecessor abusers had. How do we? I don't expect you to solve this right here on the spot, but
okay.
what comes to mind as you think about it?
I think part of what we do is we ask that question over and over again of ourselves, and we take personal and communal responsibility for, first of all, how do we behave within the immediate communities in which we have influence and in which we can affect the tenor of discourse. I like to make a distinction, and also I think that growing edge is manifest within communities everywhere in the world, no matter where there are conflicts, of people who are reaching out and trying to figure out where they can grow together. I think that we delude ourselves if we think that our soul searching and internal community arguments at such a distance from some of these places of real pain and interactive suffering of various kinds, that this is where all of that's going to get solved. I'm not sure that there isn't something to be done around how do we live into the model of how we would like to see communities be able to function in a more wholesome and peaceful manner. And I think it is possible for us to learn that and do that. I don't despair, because I think that everywhere where you would raise that kind of a question, I think there are people right there on the ground who are doing their best to do that work against tremendous odds. And I would encourage us not to make the category error of associating inextricably religion and faith.
I mean, the idea that we have seen countless people, and certainly countless power groups, who performed that kind of jujitsu on religious experience and cultural experience, and tried to hijack a deep, questioning spiritual odyssey, and those communities that see their spirituality as a way forward and as a cutting edge, and those who would co-opt it and use it as a kind of an identity platform from which to launch more unscrupulous projects. And so it's easy to conflate the two. It's easy to blame the Christians for colonialism when we've seen, and yet it was out of a Christian movement that the civil rights movement, by flipping it on its head, by cashing the check, by forcing Christianity to go back to its roots, we can find there was another Christianity all along, and I think that's fair to say.
It's like when you take the word seriously, and you try to hold yourself to what to the aspirations to which they direct you, you're going to get someplace different than if you're cherry picking passages that let you sustain the status quo. And the way we see that should I go back to the identity question? Yeah. Okay. I think that's a really profound question, and that the answer has to be different for Jews and for the African Americans, or for the Africans who were brought here enslaved and had to figure out how to understand who they were in an entirely painful and unnatural and abusive circumstance. At least for those who were working on the process of using the tools that Israelite scholarship and communal process had been working on for several hundred years. By the time the temple is lost, you have the process, you have standards for using interpretation to reimagine who you are, who God is, how you live within the context that you now confront politically and socially and so on. And those questions don't go away. So in every generation, they were addressed with slight tweaks being made all the time. When you had a crisis, again, the expulsion from Spain was such a catastrophe, like a second exile. It was felt as deeply by those Jews who were expelled from Spain and Portugal as the expulsion from Roman Palestine had been felt. And that occasioned a new round, particularly in the mystical tradition, of interpretation that reframed just how intimately integrated our suffering, God's suffering, the world's suffering, the cosmos' suffering have become, and what we get to do to help repair that. So the identity then becomes, to me, what it leads up to is the radical compassion of someone like the Piasetzner Rebbe, Rabbi Kalonymus Kalman Shapiro, was one of the rabbis in the Warsaw Ghetto. He and his community from Piasetzna were brought into the ghetto, and in the 2.5 years before deportation to Auschwitz, we have the teachings, the sermons that he wrote down, the teachings he offered at different holiday times, his evolving theodicy, his evolving understanding of why this horrible thing is happening, to what purpose, and where is God in this. And he came to see that we, who can be the object of an oppressor, of a murderer, of destruction, can be. It's a different kind, perhaps, of substitutional atonement. The people stand in for the God that, in his understanding, the Nazis wanted to kill. So anything that any of us can do when we are oppressed, to offer even, if we can remember to say a blessing a day, if we study 3 words of Torah, if we give somebody a word of encouragement, whatever we can do reaches God, who is weeping in God's innermost chamber, because God knows that people are suffering because God is the object of such primal hatred. I don't even begin to imagine how to live that kind of a compassionate theology, to tell people who know they are going to be murdered, no matter what little thing you can do, you have the power to give life to God. How extraordinary that is.
I mean, I think in relationship to your question, Frank, of the relationship between a communal identity and resilience, I don't know if it's essential, but I would say the very nature of the spirituals points in the direction of what Cheryl Kirk-Dugan would call a collective exorcism. The spirituals are a collective exorcism of selfish individualism. So in the idea that, not just in terms of how they were created, in the midst of a community, in the midst many times of a communal event, of preaching perhaps, that you have this deep sense you don't know who the author is. There's no one's name associated with these songs. We don't necessarily exactly know where they were created, a place, because they are anonymous. They are our songs. They are the community songs. And so in many sense, yes, I think our resilience, or what we see through the spirituals, resilience is strength in the sense that we are not alone, that others are with me. Cloud of witnesses, I am because we are. There's a deep sense, or African sense, of community, of family. That's why so many of the spirituals speak of going home, home. Slavery separated one from their homeland, their language, their culture. And so you have this deep loss of a sense of persona arriving in the Americas. And so there's this deep yearning for home, because home is where mom, dad, sister, brother, the network, the family, the community. And so in many ways, the sense of resilience is strengthened or renewed or encouraged by others who are with you, on this particular journey. I think that's...
Yeah.
And a subversive message that we are whatever you choose to call us, and we can't change that. Mm-hmm. Whatever you choose to call us, we are also the people who sing about community life, who sing about sharing, right, who sing about all of those values over and against the values that built this thing that has enslaved us. That song continues to be sung in spite of the edifice of pain and selfishness that you built. So you can be that identity, and it's subversive. I don't even hear that you're in that, because I keep calling you that name we gave you.
That's right. And it's we are climbing Jacob's ladder, not I am climbing. Yeah. Yeah. We are.
It's a big ladder.
That's
a big ladder.
Very un-American idea. Yes, ma'am.
I want to change the tone of this a little bit. The spirituals helped with our survival. but we were brutalized, murdered, cut off from our roots. And we're the only people that I know of that have no roots from where we were brought from. When I'm in a group and people are talking about recipes that came from the old country or from great-great-grandparents, I'm the one left out because I have no idea of where my people are from. The other thing is, we came here, we were brutalized, we were murdered, cut off from our roots, treated as less than human, 3/5 of human beings, land stolen, property stolen, and this was not by communists. These were Christian, God-fearing people that did this. Native Americans had their whole communities wiped out. Forced poverty now is the thing that we're dealing with because nobody in the faith community wants to deal with 300 years ago and how that's causing suffering today. The drugs, the guns that are imported now into our community, which are causing genocide in my community because it's wiping us out every day. But we only hear about it in the newspapers when it's a sensational story. But as for getting in the trenches and saying, this is the way to start, we've got to admit what was wrong. We've got to admit we're going to have to repair it one way or another, or the outcome is going to be something very ugly. So the spirituals were looking to leave earth to find freedom because of hell on earth that's still existing today. And we don't want to discuss what it's going to take to stop what's going on in my community.
If I can move that and maybe try to frame a question, and if I've taken away in framing that question, if I've moved away from your narrative or the import of what you said, pull me back. But I hear a question in that that goes something like this. Is this form of resilience, and there are many forms, something that glosses over the pain, that gets us past it without really transforming it? Is it a kind of a Band-Aid or a palliative kind of response to a horrific catastrophe which leaves the core problem unaddressed?
I think the spirituals can be used as a form of escapism from reality, and what you point to, ma'am, the reality's on the ground. And there is that we can just sing about the pie in the sky and forget what's happening right here on earth. And there was that danger. I mean, Howard Thurman feared in his interpretation of the spirituals in his book Deep River, he believed that it was really the other world that was so stressed. And then you had other interpreters that, that revised that history. And so there is that potential, I think. But what we've seen in the civil rights movement and other movements is that the power of song can also be used as a form of empowerment toward action, not just singing in the streets, but then that being a source of empowerment, community development, energizing concrete action, whether it's poverty or drugs or violence, you name it, that it can also serve in a very constructive way. But there is always that, I think, danger that even our tools that might have been in years past, centuries past, very concrete forms of resistance and perhaps effective resistance, that now they are no longer working for us, which is why maybe, there are many. One can't assume that the spirituals are even being sung. People have let them go for a variety of reasons, even within the black community. I mean, that's historically true as well for a variety of reasons. And so I would say I think there is a possibility that it can be disconnected, detached from reality, but it doesn't have to be that way.
It also strikes me that what you're touching on is so important, because it reminds us that if we want to talk about resilience and look for examples within varying human communities for ways in which resilience was nurtured and was able to flower and help sustain people through very difficult times. It doesn't mean that we cease being in difficult times and that we have to stop working with the resources we have out of our own histories, out of our own the previous material, what might have worked for your mother or your grandmother. If it's not working for you, what in your generation, what's the power of the word or the music or the protest or whatever mechanism? I mean, it has come over the past year or so to me that maybe we need to think a bit more about the ways in which we organize ourselves, whether it's in religious communities or in communities of purpose. We've seen a lot of that in North Carolina, thank God, in the last 2 or 3 years in response to political changes, where you have communities of purpose that are forming in order to resist what are perceived as unjust decisions by parts of our government. Whatever the community is or the social group is, knowing that it's within the human capacity to devise a transmissible form of mutual support, of reassurance that every one of us has to matter in this universe, that nobody comes into being by accident, that we all carry part of the divine potential for continuing to evolve as a species. We are slow learners. We are not as smart a species as we think we are, but we have mechanisms, and I think that's what Luke was saying before, is it may not be that it remains the spiritual, but what was the impetus behind that? What's the form, the art, the creativity, and how do we harness that human capacity in the service of our lives' struggle?
Right, and one of the dangers of celebrating resilience is the trap that in celebrating that you lose sight of the ultimate calamity and the catastrophe, and you say, "Oh, isn't it wonderful how those people got over that?" Not over it. Not over it. It's what you said. It's about the idea that we can stay with it long enough, even if it's longer than my life. We can stay with it long enough and find something deep inside us as individuals and us writ large as a community to keep this project going long after I'm dead, because there are people who are out there resisting this message of change and reform. And through resilience, both personal and communal, we just might be able to outlast them and finally declare victory, even if I'm not here to see it. So that's why I think there's any importance at all in celebrating a thing called resilience. Yes.
The first thing that I have to confess is that I have a European education. It is a European hegemony. I am not European. And when I contemplate the idea of Black resiliency, when I also recall the framing of the New World Order, which is supposed to be gradually evolving, and I don't feel that I need to go back to my perception of the ideology of the New World Order, which I think I remember starts with the Illuminati and the connection between Prescott Bush and Adolf Hitler. I won't go back any further than that. But when I do that and contemplate the New World Order, I see contemporarily every time those of us Africans in America attempt to appropriate Black resiliency, something happens to cut us down. And I think that gradual nature of the New World Order, for me, calls up all of these venues in which we are attacked. And when I say we, I mean Africans in America, and particularly the descendants of the enslaved Africans. I see it in the state-ordered violence of killing innocent people. I see it, the young people now don't even get an education of European hegemony. And I don't think I need to go on and on. The thing I think that has helped me to experience a little bit of Black resiliency, I give the credit to those wonderful Black scholars who organized under the title, the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations, which go way back to the time that Jesus, as a precocious youth, studied at the Egyptian mystery school, and it resulted in him becoming a master teacher and a radical revolutionary. As far as I'm concerned, the organized church is doing nothing. You are silent. I do not waste my time going to church. So what are you going to do? And I ask that question generally of the two religious people. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I think what I won't answer for myself, but I can answer for, in some ways, the community in which I currently serve. Every congregation has to do their part, even if it's a little part. And one congregation is, or faith community, cannot do everything. But every congregation can do something, even if it's one thing. Where I currently serve, we have various outlets of community outreach that are linked to engagement with urban ministries. So one key thing in my mind is partnerships with other organizations in the Durham community, and not trying to necessarily create something on your own or duplicate what is already out there. So partnerships with urban ministries, partnership in dealing with, let's say the Genesis Home is also dealing with homelessness and poverty. The Religious Coalition of Nonviolent Durham is another partnership. And so the Interfaith Hospitality Network, I think there are avenues that we, the particular community where I'm located right now, Duke University Chapel, are connected in trying to do our small part to get involved, get connected, serve. Even Durham can, trying to understand policies and other networks, even if it's behind the scenes. It may not always be on the front lines, but how can we work towards a more just society, the beloved community? But I think what's critical in going forward, wherever we may find ourselves, is that we attempt to work together. Because one of the things, I've been in Durham for 3 years, is what I recognize is that there's, whether it's the nonprofit organizations or whether it's many of the congregations, there are not a lot of partnerships. There's not a lot of collaboration. And I think until we find ways and discover ways to actually work together and not to try to create our own necessarily program, that until we actually learn how to cooperate together for the common good, then there will not be a greater change in our communities. Just pick the issue. But I think if we can do our part, but do it together with partnerships with nonprofits and other organizations, we can move. Every rung goes higher and higher. And we may not get to the top of the ladder, but we can continue to go one rung at a time and do our part and try to be as faithful to our God as we know how. That's how I would answer that right now.
Thanks. So I ask you to take as a given that the small faith community of which I am the rabbi is also engaged in communal efforts that involve people from a wide variety of racial and socioeconomic levels, and that the problem that Reverend Powery named of inadequate interconnectedness in our communities is a true indicator of how much work we have to do. I think what I would prefer to do is get all theological on you all here for just a minute. They say that every preacher really only has one sermon, and we just find multiple ways to convey the same message. So my stump speech has to do with the significance of lowering boundaries, lowering those friction points that allow us to pretend that we aren't all of the same source. So if I take the narrative in Genesis and I ask myself, what happened when Eve and Adam had some fruit for lunch? That what happened was that the human capacity to make distinctions, which was already in evidence, because when asked the question, you want to do this or not, Eve was capable of formulating an answer. So it's not like she didn't already know the difference between this or that, but that infusion of the power of distinguishing that which can be separated out of the wholeness that is our reality, that has led us to an enormous, perhaps the preponderant degree of suffering we have inflicted on ourselves throughout human history. So from a theological perspective, I would invite you to consider the possibility, or maybe do it just as a bit of an exercise in quantum physics. Just take it as a function of the Big Bang, but we're all made of the same stuff. And anything that we do where we choose to say, oh, well, you're a different color than I am. Well, that social construct be damned. It's not a meaningful statement, because there is no less, if I take the Big Bang as a quantum event or as a theological event, if I say that singularity blew out of a divine source and everything, no less this stage under my feet or you or I or anybody here or anything else we ever encounter, including the garbage dump, it's all God. So how do we get off separating ourselves as much as we do and holding on so tightly to our tribalisms and our historical hatreds? If we don't get over that, there's just not enough hope for us. So that's where the resilience comes in, and that's where the necessity for collaboration comes in.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you. I would just like to make a comment rather than a question, and I do it very humbly. I recognize how really wonderful the people on the stage are, but as I approached my decade of the 50s, after having lived most of my life as a Christian, I began to be a student of history as well as of current events. And I found that much of the pain and suffering throughout time, as we've discussed, has been because of community, because we have divided ourselves into community by race or by religion or by country of where you live, or so many various things, Democrat versus Republican. It's all these different communities that have destroyed life on earth forever. And to use the term that the other lady used of our, and now I've forgotten it, but the future, help me down there, the New World Order, yes. I think we cannot have a successful New World Order until we stop having so many different communities. And we just have one big human community.
I was just going to say, there's really just, race as it functions today is a social construction, but there's really just one race, the human race. And we just haven't recognized that. We haven't learned how to live into that.
And I would like just, I know we have very little time, but to say a word in favor of diversity. The reason there are so many alternative ways of understanding anything can be a curse. You're absolutely right, and it can also be a blessing. So part of the struggle that calls on our human capacity for resilience is to understand the value in having, being able to identify with, but not to excess, a community that shares that lens, and realize that it's only one of the possible lenses. And to allow ourselves to, I'm committed to reducing Jews' Jesus allergy, right? If there's something that, that particularly, that you see people particularly reactive around and it bothers you, work on that with them. We lose too much if we give up, not giving up tribalism, but giving up the sense that if there's a divinity, that divinity, I was told by a biologist I was wrong in saying there were 3,500 different kinds of cockroach. She said, oh no, there's at least 30,000 kinds of cockroach. I'm so thrilled to know that. If there is a God, that God loves diversity. Otherwise, there is no explanation for 30,000 different kinds of cockroach. I'm done.
But, well, let me, all this stuff happens, but I'm going to close this out with a reflection of my own, only because I've just returned from India. My daughter married a lovely man from Tamil Nadu, southern India, and so I immersed myself in Hindu culture, visited many temples, and learned an awful lot. First of all, I learned that in Hinduism there is only one God. Hindus believe in one God, and all of those other gods you've heard of, Vishnu and Ganesha and Kali and the others, are manifestations of the one God. Some are considered avatars like Jesus. They are God's sort of representative on earth, infused with divinity. It gets a little complicated, but ultimately there is only one God and many, 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 many manifestations of which we are all. And the theory, the theology that holds it all together is God is too big to be believed in one way. For Hindus, the idea that there are Christians and Jews and Muslims is the most obvious thing in the world. Of course there are Jews and Christians and Muslims and Hindus. God is too big for one religion. God is too big for one manifestation. God is way too big for our puny little heads to get around and actually say this must be who God is and how God represents God's self here on earth, if earth is a thing that is less than or apart from God. And I thought, well, that's kind of profound. No wonder y'all have been around so long, you know. So it was humbling for me. I have been in and out of my Christianity, and I wander, you know, sort of in and out and find myself in various places along the spectrum for a variety of reasons, including the sense of hypocrisy and all of those things that can be painful to people of critical thought, but also of a kind of a deep longing for something beyond, something transcendent. And so yeah, I get how the journey goes, and I also understand that deep need to bring people back to the radical, mystical truth that is Jesus. And you know, in your religious communities, if there's a guy like me who decides he's gonna start re-practicing his Catholicism and hang out with the guys and share some of these ideas about the mystical Jesus, you realize that maybe you can do some good within that community, because now people are actually beginning to listen and recontextualize and understand the Jesus who they thought was the white guy in the holy cart with the pretty hair, who just wanted you to be nice. So I will say, I don't mean this to be the ultimate lesson, but I will say that I find that diversity is powerful, that God is too big to be held in a single idea, and that, you know, weaving in and out of religion is probably not a bad idea. All right. Well, yes, ma'am.
Thank you for indulging me. At 85, I look back in retrospect. I did have the experience of being involved with people of many, as the Reverend Dr. Powery mentions. Race is a human construct. I learned that in high school biology. However, having said that, I would like the group to know that my husband and I lived together for over 52 years. He was a highly trained theologian, Howard University, Boston University, and Harvard, not Howard, but Harvard too, but Harvard in Cambridge, Howard in D.C. He reminded me of the ministry of Jesus. The reason I know that, I know right now I don't have any money. When he implemented his ministry, I was at home and participated in the Selma to Montgomery March. My husband and I were together and pinned in First Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, when the Freedom Riders came through. And why do I try to put this in context when I contemplate Black resiliency and the fact that there's only one God and we all come from the same source? I keep experiencing the absence of what I thought was so beautiful that I perceive does not exist now. I hope I put that in context. It only means something to me as I keep wrestling, and I thank you for allowing me this privilege.
I thank all of you for the deep thought and the ideas and the attention that you brought to what I think is a very important subject. Thank you so very much for being here tonight. And thank you, Reverend Dr. Powery and Rabbi Jurovics.